Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, we'll be building a CI/CD pipeline that automatically deploy a Python application that is hosted on GitHub and deploy it to AWS Lambda function. So AWS Lambda function is a serverless compute service by AWS that allows us to run our application without having to manage servers. So what that means is our application only runs when our user make a request to our application, and we only pay for what we use, as opposed to buying a server and managing a server. Also, we'll be using Codebuild, which is an AWS service, as a pipeline to detect change from the Python application that is hosted on GitHub and deploy the application to AWS Lambda function. To follow this tutorial along, you need an AWS account. The services in this video are available in the free tier, so you won't incur any cost through the process of the tutorial. So let's get right into it. So the first thing we are going to do is to create a Lambda function that we want our application to be deployed to. So when you come to the console here, you can click on Lambda. So we click, this is the Lambda page. So we click on create function. So to create a Lambda function, you have three options. You can create from scratch, you can use a blueprint or use a container image. For now, we'll create our function from scratch. So we name the function name Python application. So on Lambda, you can use any programming language, you can use Node, you can use .NET. For our tutorial, we'll be using Python, 3.12. And then we just, the rest default. Then we click on create function. So our Lambda function is already created. So if you come down here, so say we have successfully created the Lambda function, we can change this code and configuration. So when you come down, you can see the diagram representation of the Lambda function. Then there is this code source. So it's currently loading our function. So by default, since we select a Python application, it's created a default setup for us, which is the lambda function.py, and it has a default function that we have here just saying hello from Lambda. So what we now have to do is to go to our GitHub and find a way to deploy our application to this function. So notice that it has a lambda function.py and a definition, a function of lambda handler. This is like the entry point for this lambda function. So any application that we are trying to deploy to this lambda, we have to have these entry points for it to work correctly. So now that I've successfully created our lambda function, let's go to the next step is to go to our GitHub to see our Python application. So here is the Python application that is hosted on GitHub. It's a simple Python application. So notice that I have the lambda function.py just as I have it in the lambda function here in my code. So when you click on this, let's try to go through the code that I want to deploy. When you click on this, the application is a simple Python that make an API call to an API that returns random codes, and after making the API call, it prints the codes, and if there is an error, it will show the error on the console. So that's what this application is doing. Another thing that I want to show you in this application is the build spec file. So when I click on the build spec.yml, this is the configuration file that we use for the code build. So let's go through what this is doing. It has a version of 0.2 and it has three phases for the CI/CD pipeline. It has the install phase, it has the runtime version of the application of the Python version that you are trying to run. So if you notice in our lambda function, we are trying to create the lambda function. We selected Python 3.12. This version has to be the same with what we select when you are trying to create a Python application. And then the command for installing is pip install. It reads the requirement.txt file that is in our application here. Let's say you are deploying a Node.js application. What we'll be doing here is to npm install the application dependencies, and you also specify the version of the node that you are trying to run. So buildspec.yml file is just a file for you to like tell Codebuild how to install your application and how to build it. So this is the build phase of the pipeline. Notice that when we install, we created the lib folder for our installation. So it's cd into the lib folder, then create a zip file, and it's create a zip file. It comes back into the root folder, and then it puts the file, lambda function file, it puts it in the zip file. So why we are doing this is because any code that we are pushing to lambda function, it has to be in zip format. So what we are doing here is to put our lambda function and the installed dependencies into the zip folder, so that we can deploy that to our lambda function. So this is the post build phase, and what we are trying to do here is to upload the zip folder to our lambda function that we created earlier, and we are using the AWS Lambda CLI command, which is AWS Lambda update function code. We specify the function name, which is Python application, and then the zip file that we are trying to upload is the one that we created in the build phase. So that's what literally the buildspec.yml file is trying to do. So now that I've gone through what our application looks like, the next thing to do is to go and create the Codebuild project that will deploy our application to our lambda function. So we'll go back to our AWS console, we look for Codebuild, we open that. So these are Codebuild console. We click on create project to create build project. So we're going to create a build project, so we give it a name. Let's say Python application is our build project name. Then we want to select the source, which is GitHub, because that's where our application is hosted on. So if you are using this for the first time, you might have to like connect with your GitHub. It's just a simple process of authorizing Codebuild to access your GitHub account. For me, I'll be using the repository in my GitHub account. Let's search for Lambda CI/CD. So this is the repository. Then select that. So we want to use the main branch for this. So let's leave the rest as default. So we want to set up a webhook event. So webhook is when you want the Codebuild to rebuild. So when you click on this, you want single build, and we want the application to run when there is a push and when a pull request is matched to that main branch. So whenever there is a push to main branch and there is the pull request, so the Codebuild will automatically run again, and it will rebuild and deploy our application to our lambda function. So let's leave the rest as default. We want to use Amazon Linux as default. We want to create a new service role. Now for our build spec, we want to use a build spec file that I showed earlier in the GitHub repo. So it will use buildspec.yml file by default, which is already in the GitHub repo. So you can also insert the build command straight instead of adding it to the repository. So anyone works. For us, we are going to use the one in the repository. So we leave the rest as default. We don't necessarily want to enable CloudWatch logs. You can enable CloudWatch logs if you want to like get information about how the build goes. So then we click on create build project. So our build project has been successfully created. So for now, we've not had any build history. So before we go on, we want to make sure that Codebuild has the right access to deploy the application to AWS Lambda. By default it doesn't, so we have to add that. So we'll click on this service role and open link in new tab. So this will open up in the IAM console. So you can see the permission policy that it has at the moment. So we'll click on this, which also open up another tab. So we want to edit this policy to allow the code build to be able to deploy our application to AWS Lambda. So this is the policy for this particular role. You can see what it has at the moment. That's CloudWatch Laws, Code Build, and S3. So we need to edit it to allow it to deploy to AWS Lambda. So we'll click on Edit. So this is the existing policy. So for us to add the Lambda part, so I'll copy the policy from the repo here. We have it here. So we need to add the part that will allow you to deploy to Lambda. So let's copy this and add it somewhere here. You can see this. So what this is doing is having an effect to allow, and then the action that is allowed, it allows you to add permission, to create alias, update function code, which it literally allows it to update the Lambda function. So but we have to replace this ARN with the ARN of the Lambda function that we create. For now it's having a default one. So we have to go to our Lambda function that we create earlier and copy the ARN. Then we'll come back to the policy and change here so that this policy allows it to update that particular Lambda function. So let's go. Now we click on Next to update our So when you look at it now, we now have Lambda. It allows it to have limited permission management and write access. So then we can save changes. So now our code builder have access to deploy application to AWS Lambda function, to that particular Lambda function that will copy the ARN. So back to our code build. So now we've created code build, we've created our Lambda function. So what is left now is to test the pipeline to make sure that the code build is actually getting the code from GitHub and deploying it to AWS Lambda function. So we'll go to our GitHub and make a change to our application. So let's go to the Lambda function. So let's make a simple change to our application so that we can test the pipeline. So I will edit this file and I will change this to version 1.1. So I'll commit the change. So now we make changes to our application. So by default now the code build should trigger another pipeline to trigger the pipeline to deploy to AWS Lambda function. So let's check the code build. So when we refresh this, so we see that the build is already in process. When we make the change, the webhook automatically pick it up and is trying to build the application. So we can click on this to see the process that's involved in the build. So what it will literally be doing is to go to our build spec file and try to follow that command to build the application. The build has succeeded, so let's check our AWS Lambda function. So let's try to refresh this. So after refresh, if you try to check our code source, it should have been updated after the pipeline it has deployed. So voila, so we can see that our code source has been updated with the one that's on our GitHub. So we can see the version 1.1 that will update now. So the code will automatically pulls the code from GitHub. So and to test if this is actually working, we can click on test to make sure that the application is running as we intend it to. So when I click on test, you can create new events for the text. Let's say first test. Then you can leave all the other options as default. Then I'll click on save. So our test has been successfully created, so we can try to test now using that. So it's already executing the code. So we can see that it's generated a random code and it's printing the version 1.1. So say fortune favors the brave from Virgil. So our application is working as intended. So in this tutorial now, we've gone through the process of building a CI/CD pipeline using Codebuild that automatically build the application when there is a change on the GitHub and deploys to our AWS Lambda function. And that's it for this video. I hope you've learned something or the other. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel and I'll see you next time.